evening. Oh, thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah, I am Reagan Johnson. I am the Executive Director of Alternatives, and Alternatives is based here in Hampton, Virginia, because I know we have some folks from other states joining us. And Alternatives is a nonprofit youth serving agency. We have been in the community here since 1973, working with children, youth, and families. This past year, we served over 2,000 children, youth, and families here in Hampton Roads. And we do that in a variety of ways. We focus on social and emotional development, providing safe spaces for children and young people, free after-school programming, capacity building for early childhood, and working on equity. We also have programs that give young people voice and put them in leadership roles in the community. And this evening, so I had the pleasure of meeting Casey, and from there we connected and had great discussion about the work that we're both doing in our community. And we said, we need to open this up. We need to just continue our work and build allies and let people know about how they can get involved in our community. So I'm going to introduce Casey, and we're going to go from there. And like I said, please at any time put things in the chat or use the Q&A feature. So Casey is an out and proud non-binary queer identified person and activist. They have a master's degree in gender and sexuality and a background of working in youth development and higher ed. They currently serve as the community engagement coordinator at the LGBT Life Center, which Casey's going to tell us more about, where they coordinate and facilitate LGBTQ plus youth programming. So I'm so excited that we're here this evening together.
Yay, thank you so much, Reagan, for that introduction. And thank you all for being here today. We're so excited to talk about something that we're both very passionate about, which is affirming LGBTQ plus youth. I am going to start with some slides. So I wanted to just kind of bring in some information into the room, get us kind of situated into the context that we're going to be discussing. And maybe it will also trigger some questions for you as I go through some of the slides. Like Reagan mentioned, feel free to toss those in the chat feature, message us directly, or use the Q&A, and we'll make sure and address all the questions throughout. So we want to kind of keep this conversational and just kind of keep it also about what you're interested in learning more about, as well as kind of what our curiosities are and passions are about this population. So yes, we have lots of Ferguson Build people here. We're so excited to have you.
Yeah.
All right, so let me jump into my screen share. All right. All right, are you seeing the full screen, Reagan? Okay, cool. So welcome, I am Casey Butler. As Reagan mentioned, I have a master's of science in sociology with a specialization in gender and sexuality. I am the community engagement coordinator at the LGBT Life Center. We serve all of Hampton Roads. I will talk a little bit about the center in just a minute. My pronouns are they, them. I am non-binary, and I am really excited to be here tonight. You have my email address on this screen. I will also be sure and send the slides as a PDF to our participants tonight, so you'll have access to this stuff after the conversation. You also see our website there on the slide, so you can always reference the website and kind of check out some of our services and programming. So a little bit more about the center. Our mission is to empower LGBTQ plus communities and all people affected by HIV through improving health and wellness, strengthening families and communities, and providing transformative education and advocacy. For those of you who have been around the area for a while, we did start in 1989. We were started by a nun, and she started Candy House, which was an organization serving women and children living with HIV and AIDS. It grew throughout the years to serve all people living with HIV. We rebranded as Access AIDS Care in 2006. We added the first LGBT Center of Hampton Roads in 2011, and where we started explicitly serving the LGBTQ plus community. And then in 2017, we consolidated and rebranded as the LGBT Life Center. here's just a snapshot of all the services that we do. Our clinic and counseling services are, we accept insurance and sliding scale, but most of our other services are free direct services for the community. So lots of stuff going on there. Feel free to check out our website for more information on some of these services. I wanted to kind of highlight our youth services since that's what we're here tonight to talk about. So we offer counseling services for all ages. If we are at capacity, we will share a list of affirming counselors and psychiatrists in the area. So even if we are at capacity, we still refer out to our networks. HIV and STI testing we offer for those 16 and up. They do not need parental consent to be tested at 16 and older. Housing support we offer for those 18 and up because of the requirement to be 18 to sign a lease. That's kind of our age requirement. However, you could be emancipated at 16 and be able to sign a lease. Youth Matter group is our teen support group. So that's for LGBTQ plus youth ages 12 to 18. That meets twice a month. You can see the flyer on the side there on the first Saturdays and the third Wednesdays. Once in Norfolk and once in Virginia Beach. And then we have a newer group called Family Connections. That's for families with trans and gender diverse children, typically under the age of 12, just so we can capture those younger folks that can't attend the Youth Matter group, and also for their families. So this is a family play group where the adults and parents can get together as well as the kids. And it's a really wonderful partnership with PFLAG and Hampton Roads and He, She, Z, We, which is an organization in Richmond. So of course we have the LGBTQ plus acronym. For those of you who are not familiar with what that stands for, it stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning. And then we have this beautiful plus. So the plus is, I think, the best thing to have into the acronym in a while. It was starting to get a bit long. It still is kind of long. But the idea being we could utilize all of the letters in the alphabet and we're still not going to capture the complexity of gender and sexuality. So let me give you a visual of what that looks like. So here we have the Trevor Project's national survey. They survey over 40,000 LGBTQ plus youth living in the US. And one of their surveys ask youth how they identify their sexual orientation and gender identity. And they collect over 100 different sexual orientations and gender identities, which I think is super exciting, right? So that old project of going through the acronym and memorizing the definitions, that's kind of not the best task anymore. It's a bit to where we're now just kind of deferring to the individual, right? If a young person is coming out to you, disclosing an identity that you're not familiar with, if they're coming out to you, they probably feel some trust with you. So feel free to normalize that conversation and say, hey, thanks for sharing. Like, what does that term mean to you? I find that to be a great way to kind of just have that conversation, right? Let's not avoid it. The more we talk about gender and sexuality, the more confident we can get around it. So not trying to avoid those conversations. Now, if it's someone you're not super familiar with and you don't know much about the term, you can feel free to do your research after the fact and then maybe come back another time and have a conversation around it. But never ever demand somebody explain their identities to you. That's definitely not a best practice. But yeah, so nowadays, right, I don't want you to get overwhelmed by seeing this, but this is why we have the plus. And it's also just a sign that young people in particular are feeling very autonomous around their identities. They feel determined around them. They have there's a lot more creativity. There's a lot more empowerment happening when they feel a bit more free to kind of identify themselves in ways that feel affirming for them. So this is exciting, right? I want you to feel excited about this. So I wanted to share a little bit about my story. I was born and raised in Fort Worth, Texas, very much a gender nonconforming kid. I was assigned male at birth, never really kind of fit with the boys. Didn't really fit with the girls either, although I was more interested in what the girls were doing than the boys. I kind of always felt like I didn't belong with either. And, I was definitely, during my first few years, I was much more effeminate and didn't see that that was necessarily an issue until I got into school. When I started going to school, then I started to realize, oh, wow, like this is not something that people find exciting or desirable or something that people are celebrating, right? It was something that I was being bullied around, and not only by my peers, but by my educators and administrators. I also went to a Catholic school, so I was also getting a lot of religious abuse at the time. Hearing stories about people like me going to hell, right? That we were never going to find love or acceptance, or that we would die alone and miserable. And, as young people, we internalize a lot of that. We take those messages and we're impressionable, right? So we turn that inward. And for a lot of us don't make it, unfortunately, right? As we will see in a couple of slides, the statistics around suicidality with LGBTQ plus youth is very disturbing. And there were definitely times in my youth where I considered taking my life. I considered thinking, I just thought, well, maybe it would be just better if I wasn't around. I'm so glad I never entertained those thoughts, because today I get to be that person that I needed when I was younger. And so I think it's important that we talk about our survivorhood, because this didn't end in my childhood. It followed me into my adulthood. I engaged in a lot of self-destructive behaviors. I struggled with disordered eating, with substance use and abuse. I'm a survivor of sexual assault, intimate partner violence, physical assault, hate crimes. And I'm not an anomaly. There's a lot of people in our community that have similar stories. And I think it's important that we normalize sharing these stories, so we can really put a human side to the discrimination, right? There's a lot of people out there that are looking to actively discriminate against us, to further marginalize us and make us more vulnerable to attacks. And I think that's important when we put that human side on it, because there's a lot of people that don't make it. And I'm lucky to be one of those that was able to make it through that hard time. So I know things have changed since I was a kid, but I did want to share a piece of my story too, to also personalize some of this, because when we talk about affirming LGBTQ plus youth, right, where we're talking about really holding space for young people to find their authentic selves, to show up in their fullness, in every context they find themselves in. So that's just a bit of my story. I'll also be interjecting bits of my story throughout the conversation. So I did mention the statistics. I want you to hold space for yourself in this slide. It's going to be a bit disturbing, but I'm gonna let you read through this on your own for just a minute. These are stats from the latest national survey from the Trevor Project that I referenced earlier. I think it's important to note also, when you segregate the data on youth of color and trans and non-binary youth, a lot of these statistics actually increase, just to kind of further showcase that additional marginalization that those groups are facing within our community. So what is protecting LGBTQ plus youth? We know these risk factors. We know the health statistics. We know that we're finding ourselves in systems that aren't built for us, right? They weren't built for us to succeed, to thrive, to survive. So what is protecting this group? The number one protective factor is social support. Having support from family, teachers, friends, and classmates are all directly correlated to mental health well-being in this population. On the same lines, right, building relationships with LGBTQ plus adults, peers, and allies, being able to kind of see yourself in your community, seeing yourself in the adults around you, it can be also very healing for this group. Along those lines as well, having access to LGBTQ plus role models, not only those people from within your communities, but also in politics and media and history, being able to uncover and highlight and spotlight those stories. and not just positive portrayals, but positive, diverse portrayals, thinking about all those intersections of identity that our beautiful community has. Along the lines of social support, finding yourself in supportive environments is also crucial to well-being. Those schools that have a Gender and Sexuality Alliance, or GSA, anti-bullying policies, inclusive curricula, affirming bathroom policies, and name pronoun self-determination all report higher rates of mental well-being for all students, not just LGBTQ plus students. So this is one of those examples where by centering marginalized groups, we're actually helping everybody, right? A lot of these policies are highlighting things that also straight cisgender people are struggling with. So I think that's important to note as well. And lastly, coping skills. We know that there's a lot of self-destructive behaviors that happen with marginalized groups based on that minority stress, based on that marginalization and oppression. So what we can do is normalize help-seeking behaviors with young people to offset some of those self-destructive behaviors that we see. And that can look like seeking out those resources that we are providing. This was one question that they added to this last year's survey, and I really love it. I actually have this printed and posted in my office because I think it's important to remind ourselves of where are our LGBTQ plus youth finding joy and strength. And this was just some of the main answers that they were getting. And the gender unicorn. This is our lovely little kind of graphic to help you understand what we're talking about with all of these, with gender and sexual diversity. So I think what I like about this is that each layer has also 3 sub-layers. So you can plot yourself in more diverse ways, in more complex ways. So of course we have gender identity, which is our internal sense of our gender expression, which is how we present our gender to the world. Our sex assignment at birth, which is not, it's something that's given to us, that's assigned by a doctor based on our genitalia. And physical attraction or sexual attraction, and then emotional or romantic attraction. So those have been also teased apart a bit so that we understand that there's different types of attraction as well. And one person might experience sexual attraction, but not romantic attraction, and vice versa. Alrighty, so I'm going to stop the share there. I think that's kind of enough to get us going. I hope that was a good start to the conversation. What do you think, Reagan?
Yeah, definitely. I love it. I think I'm, certainly disheartened by the statistics you showed. And I do agree with you when you disaggregate with people of color, I agree those numbers are going to go up for sure. But I am encouraged because I know we both work with young people, that young people are finding avenues and others to, whether it's connection, whether it's things like music and art, or places where they can have hope and joy. And so I think that's so important as well. I thought, Casey, we would start by first defining what it means to be an ally when we're talking about allyship, because being an ally is not just a box that we check, like, oh yeah, I'm an ally because I went to this, or I have this sticker, or whatever. So maybe if we could share, and others, please chime in. I'd love to hear what participants believe. For you, what is an ally? But I thought, since we're talking about that, because it does require a little more than just checking a box. So how would we define what it means to be an ally?
I love that question. Before I answer that, I'm going to go back to something you said about the arts. And that was a huge part of my survival in growing up, was having access to the arts. I remember my mom enrolled me in an oil painting class when I was 10. And, it was a time where I was very socially awkward and I didn't have a lot of friends. But I went to my oil painting class and I was with kind of the other misfits, outcasts. We didn't really, like
Right.
have a ton of friends, but we built that community. It was my first kind of what I would call a queer community, right? That kinship that I felt with my peers. We didn't have gender and sexuality alliances or gay straight alliances at that time. So that was the closest thing I could get. And then of course in high school, I got into theater, and the expressive arts and theater was just another place where you could find a lot of other, queer kids. So that was also very healing, the community that I had in the arts. And I think that's similar for a lot of folks.
I think so, that power and creativity and having that outlet for expression.
Oh my gosh, yes, so much so. And particularly theater, I think also just like playing with identity, playing different characters. A lot of us who are in the closet, right, are hiding parts of ourselves. And that's there's pain there, right? And so there's a lot of like also paranoia around like who's going to know my secret, is my secret going to come out? So I think that was a safe space for me to kind of play with certain experiences, characters. So going back to your question about allyship and what is an ally, I do kind of, I talk about this in my trainings too, the difference between being an ally and practicing allyship.
Yes.
And, I think it's cool to say you're an ally, but there's also got to be that follow-up question, like, well, what do you do to practice allyship? It can't just be, oh, I attended a training and I got a sticker, right? Because that's good. That's your education. And that's definitely the first part of it, right? We have to have education. We have to have awareness. Well, what do you do once you have that education? What do you do once you have that awareness? Do you just sit and hold on to it yourself and maybe chime in every once in a while when people are talking about gender or sexuality? Or are you actually actively using that to create and foster inclusive environments for whatever community you're talking about? Right. So if it's, a white person in allyship with people of color, like how are you using your privilege? So when I see that as like my privilege as a white person is that I can pick up racism and look at it, analyze it, set it down, and walk away unscathed. Person of color cannot do that. Right? That's part of my privilege. So my role as an ally is, what can I do on a daily basis to dismantle those systems of oppression, to show and practice allyship with people of color around me, right? And it's not, there's a fine line, because you don't want to say like, oh, this group needs me to save them, or I'm coming in to rescue them, right? So it's always about holding yourself accountable to that group, that marginalized group. Right? Never ever speaking for them, but taking some of that emotional labor away from them, right? So I think if you think about that shift, right, even just the act of sharing pronouns amongst gender conforming people, I think there's an element of that. It's like trans and non-binary and gender non-conforming people shouldn't be the only ones sharing pronouns, right? We shouldn't also be the only ones, LGBTQ plus people shouldn't be the only ones coming out of the closet. That's a lot of labor to put on a marginalized group, right? So how can we all share that labor? How can we all come out of the closet, right? How can we all share our pronouns and make our environments more inclusive? So I think for me, like, there's that shift towards action. I like practicing allyship because it sounds very action, right? That verb, it's like, okay, this is a practice. It's a daily commitment. And I have to renew my commitment every day as an ally. So I think that's important when we talk about allyship. And I did see there was a question in the chat. Can you elaborate on your they, them self-identification? Yes, so those are my pronouns. So, pronouns, when we talk about those, obviously this is a hot topic right now. We're seeing pronouns everywhere, right? Social media and email signatures and virtual meetings. And so when people ask you about your pronouns, what they're saying is, how do you like to be referred, And so we use a lot of different pronouns in the English language. So we're specifically actually talking about third person pronouns. So that's where gender comes into play in our language. So when people talk about even the third person, right, there's he, she, and they, right? Those are the most common of our third person pronouns. And so what happens is a lot of people have been taught to see people's gender expression and assume their gender identity, and then the pronouns that they would attach to that. So for me, they, them is a way of saying, like, I experience my gender in multiple ways, right? I'm not just one singular thing. I'm multiple. I have a relationship with femininity, with masculinity, with androgyny, with something that's completely not even any of those, right? There's something about me that is just non-binary, right? It doesn't fit into that structure. And so they, them for me is affirming because it's not putting me in any of those boxes that don't feel right. When people use he, him for me, it makes me feel like they're seeing me as a man, right? And that's not how I identify. I don't identify as a man. Yes, I have a beard, scruff, but I also have long hair and I wear makeup. And sometimes I like to, wear more feminine outfits. Sometimes I like to dress more masculine, right? There's some fluidity to my gender. And I think that's a beautiful thing. I think it's fun, it's creative. And I think we've gotten to a point where gender has felt so like a prison, like it's something that we're put into, and it's like, you can't move, like this is who you are, and you're being told this is who you are. And I love young people today because they're saying, we're not going to follow that. We don't care. Like, we're going to find our own journey. We're going to find our own story. And so, I don't know, it's exciting for me. So they, them, everyone's going to have a different relationship to that. Just because you use they, them pronouns doesn't mean you identify as non-binary. I think there's a conflation that happens with pronouns and gender too. So just because someone uses he, him doesn't mean they identify as a man. Just because someone uses they, them doesn't mean they identify as non-binary. So making sure that we really are just treating pronouns like names, So when you look at someone, you wouldn't say, hey, you look like a Joe, I'm going to call you Joe, right? You ask them their name. So that's the same with pronouns. We're just starting to add them to our name. So you're going to see them in parentheses after people's names now. And that's just a way of saying, hey, when you talk about this person in the third person, you're going to use those pronouns. And sometimes you have multiple pronouns as well. So understanding that not everybody has only one pronoun. Someone might use she and they pronouns. So you just kind of alternate between the two, right? You can pick one for one context and shift to the next on another. So yeah, I mean, we could talk about pronouns for a long time. So hopefully that answered your question, Jocelyn.
Casey, what does the LGBTQ plus community need from allies? What would you say?
We need folks. Okay, so part of that, like where I was talking about taking on some of that emotional labor, as a white person, I'm constantly trying to educate other white people, my family members, my friends, about racism, about racial equity, about the experiences of people of color. Do I speak for them? No, right? I'm always held accountable, but I'm taking some of that burden off of them, right? As marginalized people, having to educate people about ourselves constantly, it's exhausting, right? So I think what we can do as allies, or what you can do as an ally to the LGBTQ plus community, is to educate your straight cisgender friends around some of these topics, some of the complexity. I think especially with LGBTQ plus, we know that there's huge gaps in education. We're not getting this information in schools, most of us. When I do these trainings, I would say about 80% of people, when I do polling, will say that they've never learned about this stuff in schools, right? They're learning about it on the internet, or, they'll research on their own, but there's no curriculum that's being taught about this, so it is something that we're having to kind of fill in the gaps, right? So I think as allies, one of the biggest things you can do is help educate the people in your life that aren't members of the community about some of the struggles that we encounter and about some of the best practices that you can engage in. So yeah, I think that's probably a big thing that you can do. And then after that education, right, is consuming media from LGBTQ plus people, right? Reading our books, watching our movies, talking about gender and sexual diversity with your kids, normalizing these conversations, celebrating LGBTQ plus people as positive contributors to society, right? Not as some like dirty little secret that we can't talk about, or some taboo, that you're not supposed to talk about, right? Because we all have a relationship with gender and sexuality. And I think the more comfortable we get about talking about it, the more we can celebrate that diversity and make sure that our environments are inclusive for people in this community.
I love how you talk about awareness first and educating ourselves, because I do think, like to your point, a lot of us may not have had learned about this in school. And I know like we work with young people, and some of the young people we work with are like, we don't talk about this in school. We're learning about social media. Our teachers don't talk to us about it, or maybe because of our families don't talk about it or have certain opinions. And so being able to educate ourselves first, to have that education, that awareness. I know when I first started learning, I was like, who do I need to be following on Instagram? Like who's, putting stuff out? Let me read books by people that I normally maybe wouldn't have gravitated towards, or read articles, just to start learning. And so I think that piece to educate and be aware is so important. So we've kind of talked about, how we can start with that, what are some of the best ways and how we start. I had some other questions too that I have heard people say and I think could be helpful.
Okay, cool.
If a person shares that they are part of the LGBTQ plus community, what is the best thing for an ally to say? Like, what are some do's and don'ts? Yeah. And so let's talk about that for a little bit.
Oh, yes. So, okay, first of all, don't say, oh, I already knew. Don't do that, right? I know that there's a tendency to think of that as like, oh, it kind of diffuses the situation. But what that actually says to that person is that you knew them before they knew themselves, or somehow like you had some sort of false consciousness going on, but they knew you better than you knew themselves. So that's not an affirming reaction. Don't say I already knew, right? Just say thank you for sharing. Like, that's awesome. I'm so glad, that you have told me that, right? So just kind of normalizing that, right? And thanking them is just a way of saying, hey, I understand that this isn't something that it's not necessarily that it's a bad thing, right? It's just that it's not been normalized to share in every context. And there is like very real fear that's attached to that, right? For some people, coming out can put them in a dangerous position. So also honoring that and just saying, hey, thanks for sharing. And also, I think, like I mentioned earlier, having a conversation about what that means to them, right? If somebody's coming out to you, tell me, oh my gosh, tell me more about that. That sounds awesome. Like, I want to know more, right? Showing that genuine curiosity. Definitely don't be like, are you sure? Do you know what that means? Like,
no.
Or demand that they explain, right? Like I said earlier, like, what does that mean? Like, like it's all about how you hold yourself, right? First of all, we believe people when they tell us about their identities. So never ever like question them or, have them be on the defense about whether or not their identity is valid or real, or if it exists or not, right? That's definitely not a best practice. There's also a tendency, I think, with trans identity for folks to be like, oh, I didn't know you were trans. You didn't look trans. And that's also, right, that in your eyes, maybe you're giving them a compliment, but what that's actually saying is that transness is not beautiful. It's not desirable. It's not something that you would want, or that's something that you should be able to tell the difference. And so I think that's, some of those things, a lot of microaggressions can happen in that coming out context.
Yeah.
And I think the ally in that situation doesn't necessarily understand that they're committing that. So I think my best practice for folks is just to say like, thanks, and like have a conversation around it.
Yeah.
And ultimately believing them, right? They are the expert of their life.
Yes.
And you don't know them better than they know themselves. So.
Right. I think you're so right, Casey. You don't want to be like, are you sure?
Sure.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just a phase.
Oh, right. That was going to be the other one. Maybe it's just a phase.
Who cares if it's just a phase? If it's just a phase, great. Like, how many phases do we go through in other areas of our life? Like, we can't have a phase with our gender or sexuality. There's so much fluidity that happens nowadays, and it's always been there. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
Whether folks are talking about it or not is another thing. So I think what I love about the younger generations is that they're also very open to fluidity. Right? Gender fluidity, sexual fluidity. A lot of them also don't feel like they need to label themselves. So that old kind of thing of like coming out and having a specific label that's supposed to like say everything about your identity, it's just, some youth are just like, yeah, I'm just me. And, I just like what I like.
Yeah.
And that may be somebody of the same gender, or it may be trans people, or it may be, so whatever that is, they don't necessarily need a label. Which I think is cool too.
Yeah. And I think it's so important to remember that when people share things such as this with us, there's such a vulnerability there. And whether it's this or even just things that we share with one another, that vulnerability that it takes to do that. And then for someone to be like, oh, yeah, I already knew, or no, you're not, or are you sure? Like, I can just picture myself being like, oh, this is not going to be the person that I may want to be vulnerable with again. So I think it's important to just, don't always feel like you have to respond. And that it's okay to sometimes say, I don't really know what to say. I think that's the other thing, that can be important too, but just holding space for someone to be vulnerable with us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I saw in the chat there, was it Chris mentioned, it means a lot. You can share that with me. My mother denied it when I told her I was gay. No, you aren't. Yes, right. So that false consciousness that people have, no, you're not. It's like, how do you know me better than I know myself? Come on. I wake up with myself, I spend the entire day with myself, and I go to bed with myself. That's the only guarantee throughout life, right?
Right.
So how can somebody, and sometimes I think it's important to realize that for a lot of people, it takes a lot of courage and bravery to come out to people.
Mm-hmm.
So holding space for that and understanding that, hey, like that might have taken a lot for that person to come to you.
Yeah.
And are you going to be that person's first bully? Or are you going to be their first advocate? Right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's such a big difference in how you react, right? So I think when you look at the statistics, particularly with trans and non-binary youth, just having one affirming adult can reduce suicidality by up to 50%. Just having one affirming adult in your life.
Yeah.
Someone that's going to call you by the name and pronouns that you use, someone's going to affirm you and your identity and experience. That is so crucial. And I think we underscore that a lot in our conversations. And so, yeah, it is a very powerful statistic.
Mm-hmm.
That's one that was from the most recent Trevor Project survey too.
Another question, Casey, is what if I'm afraid or worried I don't say the right thing? I use the wrong pronouns. That's kind of like that, I can't believe I just, or I'm not sure and I don't want to be offensive. What advice or suggestions would you have to allies around that?
Yes, we all make mistakes. It's okay to make a mistake. It's how you come back from that mistake, right? So the way that's not the most affirming is to be like, well, first of all, there's many ways, right? So the first one is to be combative, right? And to like try and fight about it. And it's like, okay, that person is telling you you've misgendered them. And what you need to do in that situation is apologize, correct yourself, and move on, right? So there's people that are combative, of course, that's never good. But then those people that make it all about them. And they're like, oh my God, I can't believe I did that. I'm so sorry. I'm the worst friend ever. I can't believe I did that. And it's like, okay, then you're centering your own uncomfortability with making a mistake as opposed to that person that you just offended, right? So always centering their feelings and holding yourself accountable to them. And you can do that also by showing you care by doing better next time, right? So instead of making the same mistake over and over again, if you change that behavior, you practice that pronoun with them, you practice that new name with them, to the point where then that next context where you're talking with them, you use the right name and pronouns, they're going to notice that and they're going to realize that you actually are committed to doing better. If you keep making the same mistake over and over and over again, that person is not going to want to be around you, right? You're not going to be an affirming person for them. When people get misgendered, it feels horrible, right? And I think we minimize it a lot because it can happen a lot. So I think it's important for allies to just recognize that they made a mistake, own it, apologize, correct yourself, and move on, right? And I think the less time you can spend on that apology piece, on that, oh, I'm so sorry piece, like just keep it short and sweet and move on, right?
I love that.
That's a good, and just, you have to pick your battles. Sometimes, if you were the 10th person that day that misgendered that person, you might just be the straw that broke the camel's back and they blow up at you.
Right.
So just know that this is not about you. It's about that person. And because that person blew up at you, like, don't take it personally, right? Just commit to doing better and realize that it might not just have been that encounter. It might have been a series of encounters that same day, and you just got the brunt of it. So I think that's, with other marginalized groups too, like sometimes you're the 10th person to commit that microaggression that day, and they just snap at you. And so instead of writing off that entire group or that person completely, just realizing, hey, they must have had a hard day. Like I must have contributed to something that was also going on. So just kind of also talking yourself down and making sure that you're not placing too much self-importance on yourself in that situation.
Yes.
Um,
Miss Ross said it's so important to appreciate the humanity of a person above all. We are all human. Yes. It's recognizing that humanness that we all have in one another. So
we're being and there's processes of dehumanization that are happening, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Especially with trans and non-binary and gender non-conforming people, we are seeing a lot of dehumanization out there, right? So it's like the minute we're talking about affirming trans and non-binary people want to jump to like, oh, people that identify as animals, or like they're just kind of jumping. You're like, okay, like we're dealing with people that have dehumanized us, and you're furthering that, you're perpetuating that.
Yeah.
And that's kind of at the root of transphobia too,
I think too, that now that you mentioned that, Casey, it's also important. I mean, if we look at the landscape as well that's happening right now, allies are even, getting pushed back and being, called groomers and pedophile supporters and all of these things. And so I think, our conversation is so timely because we have to pay attention, even if it's not, I always say you've got to keep your eyes open. You can't think it's not going to happen here. It's not going to happen in my school. It's not going to happen in my workplace. It's just important to, keep our eyes open and pay attention so that we know and we're not, kind of waiting at the last minute and acting shocked, for things that may be happening and how we can be allies.
And I think we should be talking about grooming and pedophilia. Like those are important topics that we need to be discussing. If you really care about that, like don't be lobbing it at people where it's not productive, right?
Right.
If you really cared about those things, let's talk about those things.
Yes.
Let's not just use that as a way to further wedge us and further divide us.
Absolutely.
Right. And just like with sports and like people that are, trying to exclude trans women from sports, it's like, if you really cared about women's sports, why aren't you funding women's sports equally? Sports,
right?
Why aren't you actually? So let's talk about that, right? If you care about safety in bathrooms, let's talk about safety in bathrooms. Let's stop scapegoating marginalized people, right? Like trans people are not your lightning rod, right? You don't. They don't need any more marginalization. Let's talk about the cisgender people that are committing these atrocities, the cisgender people that are responsible for all these things. Like so, I think it's like those solutions in search of a problem when there are very real problems that exist that we could focus on, but it's like a distraction. It's like, hey, look over here, when the real thing is over here, but it's like, no, look over there. So it's a distraction.
Yes. That kind of gets into
on a tangent there.
Oh no, you're fine. I know you and I can get on a roll on that one. How can allies advocate and amplify the voices of others? So we talked a few minutes ago about that education, that awareness piece, that it has to be though more than action. It's got to be behaviors and practices. So how can we advocate and amplify the voices of others? Are there things you think we could be doing right now?
Yeah, so I think, I think there's a shift in language happening. So I think our language is so powerful. So thinking about those easy shifts that you can make even in your speech, right? So instead of saying men and women, boys and girls, talk about people of all genders, right? Instead of gay and straight, talk about people of all sexualities. Finding those ways to make our language more inclusive. I mean, there's some easy shifts that we can make that could actually, or even looking on our forums, right? That's something that's people don't think about, right? But like, if as an LGBTQ plus person, looking at a form and not seeing yourself recognized on that form, or not having those fields that are affirming, right? Being able to see name and use and pronouns on every form, even if you don't fill those in, just knowing that they're there can feel affirming. I think there's a lot of symbols for our community too. I see, the progress flag, a rainbow flag, the trans flag. Those flags are very important, right? Those are symbols that can show people in our community that this is an affirming space for them. I think as allies, a lot of that you can do, right? Making those gestures, making those symbols visible, talking about your allyship, right? Supporting events that happen in our community, showing up to Pride as an ally, bringing your kids and sharing and celebrating the diversity of gender and sexuality. Like, I think that's really cool. I think there's so much that we can do to amplify our voices. And also, right, when you're creating programming for this community, make sure you're bringing us to the table.
Yes.
I think that's something that's really important, right? When we were organizing Trans Day of Visibility, we made sure to include those trans leaders in our community from the very beginning to help create and craft that event and that programming. So I think it's always important to, like, if you're creating programming for a certain group, or you're working with them in some way, or you want their input, make sure you bring them in the beginning, as opposed to creating something and then adding them at the very end. Say like, hey, we want you to join like this thing we already created for you.
Right. Not a best practice at all.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. You want to take some of that labor away, right? So maybe offer to do some of the logistics, maybe offer to do some of the heavy lifting, offer to do some of those admin tasks, or finding that venue, or finding sponsors, or finding funding, right? That labor can help, right? So a marginalized group, right? But also still bringing them into the table, having them, having a voice at the table is really important. It can be a lot more work, right? Sometimes it's easier if we just do it ourselves and then we add them later, but it's not the best way to do it. We're missing that perspective. When we have more voices and perspectives at the table, our programming and initiatives are going to be more expansive, right? And they're going to be more thoughtful and more inclusive. So I don't think I answered your question. Maybe I did.
You did. You gave some ideas. No, you gave some ideas. You're great. You're great. Jocelyn put something in the chat too. I'll give you a minute to read it. And then, are there any good books that really dive into the definition of all these? And also, do you see that more youth today are more open in today's time?
Ooh, good books. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of great toolkits out there. In my slides, I'll have a slide. I have a whole section on best practices that I wasn't going to cover, in the slide format, but I'm going to share those with y'all in the PDF. And there's a slide with resources at the end. And there's some wonderful national nonprofits that serve and center the LGBTQ plus community, some great toolkits, and that will help you learn the language and the lingo and some of the dynamics here. So yeah, I think that as far as books go, there's also probably plenty of great books out there. But yeah, nothing's really coming off the top of my head. It's also, this information is always changing. So, it's something that we have to continually learn. And when I talk about practicing allyship as a daily commitment, it is something like even just, renewing that and understanding that our language is evolving and being open to hearing new forms of speaking, new words, new language, just to kind of adapt. So I think that's important. And the second part of your question is,
do we see that more youth today are more open in today's time? And I know from the work of alternatives that I definitely think in our work with young people, more are open. And like you talked about earlier, just like, this is who I am and it changes and that's good. And I think the thing that I still see is where there is safe space. And so I do know in the young work that I do with young people, it is sometimes not feeling like school is a safe space, that adults our teachers, administrators are more the ones that are making young people not feel safe or inserting their own, be it religious or whatever values and beliefs that they have. So, we talked earlier about the importance and value of having just one caring adult. And I think we have to still be aware of that. And as allies, if you have children, nieces, nephews, grandkids, kids in your neighborhood, how are you that caring adult? Because you don't want to assume that for all young people or for LGBTQ plus youth, that school is a safe space, because for some of our young people I know that we work with, they're not. But I don't know, Casey, are you finding or think that that's true with the young people you work with?
Oh yeah, young people are way more open. Like, you talk to youth about these issues and they're like, oh yeah, I'm like, no big deal, moving on. Like,
Yeah.
it's the adults that we're playing catch up. Okay, so the young people are right, the kids are all right,
Yeah.
like they get it, they're with it. So I think that's a shift that we've seen with access to the internet, with access to all sorts of different narratives, ways of living, ways of being, ways of doing. Like, there's just so much diversity out there in the world, and we have access to it now. Before, like, we really didn't have that. So I think we're seeing it's a result of our times, and I think that's exciting. It's a beautiful result. And then you were talking about, my gosh, I lost my train of thought.
I was talking about schools, and some of our young people that we work with are saying to us that school doesn't feel like it's always the safest space, or adults, teachers, administrators make their own personal opinions known.
Yes, so I'm finding that too.
Okay.
Schools, but I'm also seeing the opposite. So I see a lot of kids that are being affirmed at school, but not at home.
Yes.
And I see a lot of kids that are being affirmed at home and not at school.
Yes.
Right. I think for those, and especially during COVID, those kids that were feeling affirmed at school, that were all of a sudden thrust back into their home environment, were really having a tough time.
Yeah.
A lot of the GSAs that were happening at schools went offline, right? They went on hiatus, like a lot of extracurricular clubs.
Yeah.
They didn't even have that outlet for themselves. So yeah, but you're right. There's a lot of schools that are still not affirming places, right? They don't have a GSA on campus. They don't have affirming educators. They're not getting training. And we actually have model policies in place for public schools. Now, there's no enforcement mechanism. So it's up to the individual and the family to bring any type of lawsuit or litigation against the school if they're not following those protocols. So I think it's sad, because the Virginia Department of Education went through all this trouble to create these model guidelines and to do a really great job, but there's no enforcement mechanism. So that's kind of, that's a whole other discussion. But
Yes.
yeah, there's a lot of room for improvement in schools.
Yeah.
We're seeing a lot of advances happening across the US. There's a lot of hope out there.
Yes.
So even though all those negative stories that we're hearing in the news, especially anti-LGBTQ plus, there's just as many beautiful and inspirational stories that are happening as well. We're not hearing as much. So I want to just encourage folks to not always just let the negativity just wash over you. Also, look at those other things, right? Where they're finding joy and strength. That's why I included that slide, because that's so important that we realize that, it's just, it's a tough place. It's a tough time to be a kid that's different, right? We're seeing that. And they may not be voting, they may not be up on all the legislation, but they're hearing about this. It's affecting them, right? This year alone has had more anti-LGBTQ plus legislation than any other year. And it's only 4 months in. We've already maxed out, right? So so there's just a lot of hate that's coming out. There's a lot of fear-based kind of legislation coming out, and we have to do our best to shield and protect the young people from it.
I think where I get encouraged is when I see young people organizing, and really, yes, I love it. That's where I feel like my allyship comes in, because I will get right out there with them. And I'm so encouraged by young people who are advocating, who are speaking up, who are saying we're going to make change in our school. We don't like certain things, or we're going to push back on that, or and they're harnessing social media to do it. So I love that also. And I think that's where I get hope. And I think that's too where as we as allies can come in, like you said earlier, how do we help as adults? It's that youth adult partnership. How do we help young people? So if I'm gonna, young people aren't on Facebook, that's where like parents and grandparents hang out. But if I'm going to reshare something that they've got on my social media, or if they need help, making an introduction or connecting with someone in the community. So I think too, that's where as an ally, we all can look to see how can we support young people who are, as you and I talked about, Casey, way more open, and then sometimes you're just working together on that. And so I would say to folks, that is another area where you can be encouraged and you can lend your allyship to.
Yeah, LGBTQ plus youth are amazing. I love working with them. They are super resilient, smart, creative, talented young people, and they deserve to be their authentic selves everywhere they go and show up in their fullness everywhere they go.
Yeah.
So I think that's another thing that we see all the statistics and we see them, oh, they're just so broken, they're so vulnerable, so we don't want to necessarily like perpetuate that either, because some of them are also like very, very empowered and resilient, and they are fighting to power. And I love seeing that too.
I do too. I love it. A couple people have asked about getting the presentation, being able to share it back to school counselors or share with students. I love that. Thank you.
Absolutely. I can share a link to the recording as along with the slides.
Perfect.
I think if you're comfortable with that, Reagan, I mean, I'm comfortable with it.
I'm comfortable with that. That's fine. Yeah. We have a couple minutes left. And so I do want to know, participants, if you all have any other questions, comments, things for us as we start to bring our conversation this evening to a close. Casey and I want to make sure if there's anything we can still talk about, or you have a question around, that we do that for you.
Yes. And if you're not comfortable in this context, you're more than welcome to email me as well. My email address was on the slides. You'll get those from me. I'll also email you from my account. So, so you'll have all this information too. And I'm happy to talk further about this with you in a one-on-one. I think we have a question. How often does this information get to the schools to share with all students? Ooh, I wish it could get.
I was going to say, not as much as we would like.
Yeah, so I know for the model guidelines, the only training requirement is for school mental health professionals. Mm-hmm. But we know that educators and administrators oftentimes, well, educators for sure, are spending way more time with the students than counselors are. Yeah. So I think that they should also be getting this information along with administrators. But the current guidelines are that the school mental health professionals have an annual training on LGBTQ plus cultural competency. Mm-hmm. So they are getting this information, but not everybody. So.
Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, that's so sweet. You are both beautiful inside and
Thank you, Jocelyn. Thank you.
This was really fun. I had a great time. I know we were talking about serious topics, but Reagan, you're just such a wonderful partner in this work, and the work that you do at Alternatives is so inspiring. We're just so happy to have you in our community, and you're really you have such a great legacy, with this area. So I'm just really honored to be in community with you.
Yes,
and with you all here today.
We are too.
Yeah. So
yes, we're so glad. And I hope this will be the first of many conversations that you and I are able to do together, Casey, in the community. And
we should have our own podcast.
We should. I love that idea. Oh, my wheels are going to be spinning now on that. Yeah. Yes, we'll have some young people come on too. That'd be awesome. So I love it. And we're just so thankful at Alternatives to have met and to have this partnership as we both strive and work every day to support young people here in our community, and give them both a safe space and let them know that there are caring adults for them. So I thank everyone who has come on and spent some time with us. please reach out to us. If there is anything else Casey and I can do to support you all in your various roles, I love the diversity of folks we have on tonight. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us.
Yes, thank you all so much. Have a wonderful evening.
Yeah.
Take
Thanks,
care.
everyone.
Bye.